So today I was keen to get you back on the show, which gladly you said yes to, because I wondered if we could dive into skill-based learning,
Yeah.
which has been talked about a lot. We're starting to see organisations shift over to that model. I think particularly next year, we're going to see more of that. Before we dive into the conversation, I just wonder off the top of your head if you could think of one thing that a learning manager should keep in mind as they might move towards skill-based learning next year. And put you on the spot.
Yeah. I would think, and we can sort of expand on this if you like, I would think about the skills that you actually need. And a skill is the ability to do a specific task. So as a learning manager, think about the tasks that people in your team need to be able to do and ensure either that you are recruiting against those skills or that you are developing people in order that they can do those tasks. So in very practical terms, break it all the way down to that level of tasks. What do people have to do, within the team to be effective?
And that definition of skills being a collection of tasks, if you like. So I saw a post that you put out recently on
Yeah.
LinkedIn where you had the help of visuals, which is difficult on a podcast, right? Where you were showing the differences between, for example, what you think is a skill means versus a competency, for example.
Yeah.
Could you have a go at trying to describe that difference, through this podcast?
Yeah, I will. I absolutely will. So competencies is a kind of concept which I guess HR invented. I don't know for sure. It certainly HR use it in this context, and it doesn't work for us. It's massively dysfunctional. It makes life easier for HR professionals, but it doesn't work for the business. So that's a bold statement. So let me explain. So with a competency model, you might say, well, core competencies, and typically organizations will have core and kind of technical or whatever. A core competency might be something like communication skills. And the reason HR like this is that it then becomes an organizing principle for at least three things: recruitment, promotion, and learning and development. Because you can say, okay, so we think that people need to have communication competencies, and we'll come up with a little model that says if you're a leader, you need to have a little bit more, and if you're in this role, you need to have a little bit less. And then that's handy because we can come up with competency-based questions. So when we interview somebody, we can say, think of a time when you last had to communicate something. And it's also handy because when we're looking to promote people, we can justify those promotions by saying, we think you're a little bit short of this competency. And the third and the most pertinent one is you can organize all of your learning and development around that. So for example, you can create pathways, and you do that by dragging and dropping modules from LinkedIn Learning into a pathway called communication. It's very easy. You just type in communication, and all the modules that come up, you drag them into the pathway. There you go, it's a pathway. Now, when I joined Deloitte, that sounds a bit abstract. That is exactly what had happened. The team had said, look, we've got this amazing system where somebody comes to us internally and says, we'd like a pathway around, I don't know, communication skills, and we can create one overnight. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Are people using them? And the answer was no. Nobody's using these pathways because, and this is the core problem, the competency model doesn't really relate to the skills and the tasks that people have to do on the job. And that corrupts every aspect of those three processes. So you're asking questions and people answer them, but it doesn't actually tell you whether or not they're going to be very good at the job. And you're promoting people, but based on a model which doesn't really relate to whether or not they deserve that promotion or are going to be good at the step up. And worst of all, you've got a whole world of learning stuff which is related to this competency model in some way, but employees are not using because it is not directly relevant. And they will tell you this, and they have consistently through the years. They don't see it as directly relevant to the job. And so the difference is this: you can create this whole HR fantasy world, a castle in the clouds, around competency models, which doesn't connect in those ways I've just described to the reality of the business. And the reason for that is it doesn't directly map to the tasks and skills. So an analogy that I might use is building a house. Building a house is like a big, if you can think of it as competency. But whether or not somebody can build a house depends on a number of very specific skills, like all the way down to, can you hammer in nails? Can you lay some foundations? Can you do kind of bricklaying? Can you do this, that, the other? And so if you just ask somebody, can you build a house? They might say yes. You've got no confidence that they can actually do it. What and you could create some sort of training program pathway called Building a House that talks about houses have been, built since the beginning of time and blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you wanted to develop capability, you would need to map out what are the tasks, like what are the top 20 tasks you have to do as a leader. Those might be, I don't know, managing a budget, signing off expenses, running a meeting, having one-to-ones with people. You could itemize them. And then those tasks map onto skills. So can you run a meeting? That's a specific skill. And then your training and your resources should directly map to, not the competencies, because that's too vague. It should directly map to those skills. So you should go to a leadership training course and practice some of the things you actually have to do as a leader. And the resources should help you with that. Another example, maternity discussion. That's a specific skill, handling that process well. So you would have a practice of that, and then you would have resources that would help you with that. So this is the key shift, and this is what I did the post about, that you will be in a whole world of pain your whole career as an HR professional if you are lumbered with this organizing principle of the competency model, because it's never quite going to work. It's never going to connect to the realities of the business, what people have to do in the jobs. So you could shift to being a skills-based organization, and there's research around this that it helps in a number of ways we can go into. But you'd have to be able to say, well, in a given job, what are the main tasks, the critical tasks somebody has to do? Now, how do we organize everything, interviews, promotion, learning and development, around that instead?
Yeah. And thanks for that. That was really, really helpful. And especially because you gave some examples. Let's say that I'm in an organization that's moved to being skill-based and has kind of taken that step, because it's not a tiny one, right? It's a whole new framework. In theory, I'm just, playing devil's advocate, I could still put out some learning that may or may not be used, okay? It could be ineffective. So what does it take, do you think, to make this model really work? Like, what's the difference? For example, it's not just that it's task-based. What else does it take to make it good?
I think the biggest challenge that people will face is convenience. And change is always inconvenient. Because if I actually said to organizations, what are the top 20, tasks that your leaders have to do? They would say, well, we don't know. And that's a big piece of work then to figure that out. I said, well, what are you doing today? Well, we just buy in a competence library from Acme Corporation, and it slots nicely into our LMS. So what's stopping people making that change is just the convenience. And you might say, oh, okay, that sounds a bit like they're lazy, but often you're running on a really tight budget. You've got a really small number of people. And so the first answer to your question is you'd have to start with probably somewhere with some key roles, could be leaders, could be consultants, I don't know, and actually do a decent job of mapping out what are the tasks, the critical tasks on that. And AI might be able to help with that. So just as a side note, it might be, if you've got something like Copilot, that it can actually do a pretty decent job saying, look, I'm looking at all of this activity. These are the things that people have to be able to do. And then your question was, well, that might still not get traction. So there's a culture change bit. Although actually, if you start making your training programs much more hands-on, much more skills-based, you'll probably see engagement and traction begin to lift. So you probably need to go through a bit of a transformation in terms of persuading the business that, oh no, this is actually useful stuff. This is going to help you. You also need to make sure that people can actually get access to the resources that you build that help them with the job. So UX, user experience, becomes quite important, because you can create all kinds of good things, but if nobody knows about them or can access them when they need them, then that will fail as well. So yes, it's going to be a journey, but anything worthwhile probably is a bit of a journey. You just need to have a clear vision of sort of where you want to get to, I think.
And is your take then that by being more task-based, then inherently that means you've got to be more practical, more application-focused with the learning solutions? You've at least got to have that element there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this interfaces neatly with this sort of human-centered design approach. So I'm not going to talk about 5DI, but part of what you do with 5DI at the beginning is You talk to the business about what are the practical outcomes you would like, how would people be thinking, feeling, and doing things differently. But then secondly, most importantly, I sit with focus groups, let's say leaders or new starters, and let's say new starters, I say, what did you struggle with when you joined in your role as consultant? And they will tell you all the tasks. And they'll say, well, I didn't know how to dress for different clients. There you are. That's a simple task. Where's that in the competency model? But it's a very practical thing that people struggle with. They might struggle with language. New leaders, for example, definitely struggle with leadership language. What words should I use? What do these different things mean? And I don't know, completing timesheets, signing off expenses. So you itemize these things as part of that process, and then you build training which helps them with the job. That's a very simple idea, but almost nobody does it, which is, why don't you find out what people are struggling with and build resources and experiences where they either practice those difficult bits, or they've got something useful that they can actually use. And so yes, necessarily that goes hand in hand with a shift to more practical training and more useful digital resources, instead of this kind of world of content that we find ourselves in today.
And in a minute, I'm going to ask you some questions that maybe are around how experiences might work in this model. But before we do, it feels like this skills shift, or the skills gap identification even, hasn't necessarily been driven by L&D. It hasn't necessarily come from the learning teams. It's come from beyond. It's come from higher up in this kind of stakeholder mapping, through talent teams, for example, as well, in organisations. That's what I've heard and been seeing. Presumably there's a huge benefit, right, in that you have stakeholders on board with skills. Are you seeing the same thing? Is it coming from beyond L&D, and do you see that as a good thing?
Yeah, I think you probably know more about where it comes from than I do, by the sounds of things. I have had these conversations with lots of organisations, and quite often they do come, as you say, from the kind of the talent side of things. So yes, it's quite often that broader focus, I think, around talent development, talent acquisition, and perhaps a dissatisfaction with what's happening today. That's especially true, I think, because of, well, a few different factors, but the shifting nature of work. So actually, if you've got a competency model, it's a big cumbersome thing, and it doesn't give you the fine level of detail that you need to move people around quickly. Oh, who can do this? Oh, what people, if we're now doing this, what people would be the right people to do that? And also the limited amount of time that people are now spending with organizations. I think the average now for Gen Z is just going beneath 2 years. You think about that. You need to know exactly what somebody can do very quickly, or to be able to develop precisely the bits. You can't afford to have them just sort of faffing around in the organization for a year. Like a Gen X kind of boomer sort of, oh, it takes me a year to find your feet. That world where people just kind of figure it out, and it doesn't really matter that the training doesn't work, or the competency model is rubbish, because people will figure it out. It takes them a year. That world, I think, is under much more pressure now that people are moving around, and the world is moving very quickly, and everyone's expected to be agile. So yeah, we need something a bit better.
I'm going to ask you to think about the kind of flip side of skill-based learning. We've talked a little bit about the benefits and why the model might tie better to kind of performance and outcomes. Going back to the house building example that you gave earlier, so you described that house building is made up of lots of skills, and then lots of tasks within it. For example, you need to know how to lay bricks. You need to know how to put in windows, for example. Up to there might be management tasks as well, as you were describing earlier. Let's say we gave half those tasks to Bob and half of them to Margaret, and they had the training to do those. Is there a risk in that kind of model? And I'm simplifying it hugely, that something falls down the cracks, like some kind of structural engineering gets lost, because actually there's something in there which is bigger than the sum of its parts. It's about understanding the big picture, the whole thing, and that accidentally in the house building model we could build something that kind of falls down 2 years later. Is that a risk, do you think, with this model?
Yeah, I've heard people voice that concern. I think it's legitimate. and I've wondered about it before. But I think sometimes it's a bit of a post-rationalization, if I can put it that way. It's a way that people kind of react emotionally to an attack on competency-based model. Oh, if you break it all down into specific tasks, some big thing is missed. What big thing? Because yes, it might be some meta task level, like collaboration. But if you can't describe what collaboration is, what it looks like, how you would measure it, how are you going to train people on that? Or is your assumption that it's just an emergent property that drops out of training people on the smaller tasks? So you could train, if you use the house building example, you could train people on all the things they have to do, from hammering nails, laying bricks, and maybe working with a team is something that just emerges from doing all of those tasks in this kind of collaborative fashion. But maybe not. But maybe it's then one of the tasks that you have to train people in, so collaborating with a team. And then you have to think about, well, what does that involve and how would you practice it? So I do think that part of that challenge is legitimate, which is that there are low-level tasks, hammering in nails, laying bricks, higher-level tasks like project management and organizing a team and understanding and being inclusive, as an example. But that doesn't mean you can't practice them, or that you just have to say, well, just leave it to chance. You still have to be able to say, well, that's a skill. Being inclusive. I run experiences which train people on exactly how to be inclusive. And I think that's a good thing, because if you just leave it in a very abstract box, then you're not really going to be able to reliably assess where people are today, what people you need in the future, and how you're going to develop it. So, yes and no.
Yeah. And I think with the skills-based model as well, I think sometimes people have concerns, which might be, as you say, initial emotional reactions, and we're not all great with change, right? But that you could have the same skill that needs to be done in very different contexts. So is there a risk that contextual application could get missed? That actually in the skill model, you could very much still throw content at it that could miss that hugely. Is that something you've kind of thought about as well?
Yeah. So we had a framework for thinking through those sorts of problems at Deloitte, which I found helpful. Maybe other people will. That was common, aligned, distinct. So organizationally, we had to separate out, be clear on who was accountable for what. There's a lot happening in a big organization like Deloitte. And so we talked about common skills and distinct skills. And distinct skills were things that you would only find, let's say, in audit. Common skills were things that you would find in any part of the business, like leadership. And so the way that worked is you say, well, we're accountable for the leadership skills and you're accountable for audit skills. But the aligned bucket was those things like leadership in audit, where there was a degree of contextualization of those skills, exactly as you describe. And there what we needed to do was collaborate. We needed people from the central team who knew about developing leadership skills to work with people in audit who knew about that context to come up with something which was specific to that audience. And there are a couple of ways of doing that. One is you just kind of modify it and adapt it. The other is that you have elective elements. So there might be things which are, wherever you're working, building a good relationships with the team. But then there might be a module which is specific to audit teams, so you have that as a bolt-on. So yes, it's a really good point, and it is more complex, I guess, in a way, if you are working at that fine level of detail with skills. But yes, I think there are ways to do that.
Yeah, and what I'm throwing out here is something that happens now, right? So context and application and practice can get missed off a lot of training models right now. So it's not that I'm saying that it's because we're moving to skills-based. It's actually I'm saying, does that risk still exist in that model? And I think also with the stakeholder involvement, which is I think a huge opportunity, it's a great thing, because it should, in theory, bring about some joined-up thinking and focus and goals. I know a lot of people are kind of expected to move at speed to fill the skill gaps. Fill the skill is the new saying might be. Yeah, do you think that it could be hard in some organisations not to feel that pressure to just deliver content, to meet those skills? Job done, tick the box, move on.
Isn't that just true of life, though, generally? Generally, it's easier in almost every aspect of life to go with the flow.
Mm.
But what will you have accomplished? But you see, this is what I mean, is like this tension. You have to be a certain peculiar kind of annoying person to be, so fixated on achieving some kind of result that you're prepared to disrupt the convention along the way. You know what I mean? Because I mean, there are different. That sounds like a slightly offhand remark, but a lot of people's lives are just, what is it, maintaining the kind of consensus, and that's certainly true in business. And so you need, I think, to have that tension between the two, between people who are happy to do whatever is expected of them, people who want to kind of push on. And I think one of the big meta cognitive lessons in my life has been know about pace, understand pace. It's like if you want to get to the top of the mountain, you might be, an accomplished mountaineer, able to sprint all the way up to the top, but not everybody in the party is, and you have to think about everybody's needs and go at a pace which is going to work for them. So yes, there are challenges in kind of moving to a model like this, and it will be hard work. But those will be the things that you develop from and have the most impact.
Yeah. And then they're not new challenges either, right? As I was saying before, it's not because we've moved to skill-based that suddenly speed is a new thing, that pressure. I wanted to pick your brains on a kind of final aspect of this. Obviously, you talk about developing resources versus developing experiences in learning, which you might want to take a moment to clarify in a minute. I can see how resources fits in hugely to the skill-based model because it's tasks and you need tools and resources to help you in the moment, I imagine. What about the experiential side? You mentioned earlier about you create inclusion experiences, and that is a skill, if you like, that you focus on this kind of skills involved. Help me see how we can get experiential about skills-based learning.
Well, at a very basic level, if you knew what tasks somebody had to be good at in a job, let's take consultant. You're a new consultant, and they have to be able to run a meeting, organize and run a meeting. They have to be able to put together a proposal. They have to be able to pitch the proposal, let's say, and they have to be able to build, strong relationships, build rapport with clients. So you can start to break out a role like that into discrete tasks. And then a good program does two things. It gives them a chance to practice those things, which is why it's experiential, and it gives them the resources that they need. So as an example, pitching coming up with a proposal, you might say, well, here's a session where you get together in small teams and we're going to give you a brief, a scope, something that a client has asked, and we want you to come up with a proposal, and then we're going to critique it. And that's an experience where you try something, you get some feedback, maybe try again in a safe sort of space. But alongside that, you've got a pool of resources, and those resources might be a template, might be an image library. So you notice that they're not learning. They're not learning resources in that sense. They might be top tips. Maybe that looks a bit more like a learning resource, or do's and don'ts of a proposal. Good examples, bad examples. And so you've got an opportunity to practice doing that thing, and then some resources that actually help you. What you haven't got is a pathway. And you don't need a pathway, and nobody wants a pathway. And in general, this is something that people really, I think, struggle to get their heads around. A learning pathway is always tasks. It's just mind-boggling to people is that somebody's learning pathway is generally their job. If you wanted to create a learning pathway which challenged people beyond the job, it would be tasks. It would be things like run a meeting, shadow a colleague, manage a budget, run a project. It would be a learning pathway is a set of tasks, like challenges. It is not a set of content. That's just nuts. That would never work. Is that when you think, well, where does the content go then? Well, the content supports those things. If somebody said, well, one of your challenges is you've got to have 3 maternity conversations. You've got to arrange, maternity arrangements for 3 people. That's your challenge. You want to step up into leadership? You need to do these things. And then somebody might say, oh, well, and now I need to know where the policy is. Okay. Oh, now I want to watch this video from somebody saying, well, first time I did this, these are some of the mistakes I made. So, but the learning pathway is always the challenge. There's no content in a learning pathway. So I've said that a few times just because I think we've got so used to this idea that learning pathways are just, set of content. But back to your original question. So hopefully that explains how the experiences and the kind of the resources sit together.
Mm.
And you could imagine building those into some sort of roadmap for somebody so that if they wanted to be a senior consultant, you'd say, well, you're going to have to find opportunities to practice doing some of these things like, leading a whole project, managing a budget, and so on and so on. And then that becomes something that everybody owns because you can see how that works, right? Somebody says, well, you want to be a leader. A good thing to do would be to lead a few team meetings. Okay. How can I help you to make that happen? And then the business has got the confidence that people actually have those skills because they haven't just sat on Cornerstone, clicked their way through a module on leading a meeting. They've done it. They've actually done it, and they can evidence that they're capable of doing it. So all of these things fit together in quite an obvious way when you sort of you've got the picture. But one thing I should say, I think before, because I think you said that was the last question, is that all of this sounds very big, very kind of strategic, but actually shifting to skills-based can be as simple as just taking a requirement for a degree out of job descriptions. I did that quite a lot at Deloitte because it was like, well, that's not skills-based. We're just saying somebody needs a 2-1 or better. It's like, well, why? How does that relate? Why don't we write some of the skills into the job description so they're actually hiring people who've got the skills to do the job? And there is some research around this. I think some of it dates back to 1984, some of it 2021 I was looking at, that this is a much better predictor of actual performance. If you take the degree out and you hire for skills, and also people will stay longer. Something like a 34% uplift in how long they'll stay. So people perform better and they stay longer if you just start taking out degree requirements and actually shift your job descriptions in the direction of describing the skills that people need to do the job. So
interesting.
They're just kind of small, obvious things that people can do as well.
Yeah, I think we are starting to see that as well, like more skills listed.
Yeah.
And you hear also of, because obviously AI is sometimes used to measure if CVs match those. So you've got the kind of skills taxonomy kind of match up kind of going on as well, which is the talent side of things.
Yeah.
But we're seeing that come in. I guess what people then realise is more about the job. They understand it more in kind of practical terms than they might have otherwise.
Yeah.
It was kind of my last question to round off the skills-based conversation. I do have some sneaky other ones up my sleeve though, before we go. But just before we just completely move away from that conversation, have you got any kind of final tips or thoughts that you might just lend out to learning managers who are perhaps looking at this shift to being skill-based next year for the first time?
I think the main thing is it can just seem like such a big, unmanageable shift to make such a big agenda. So I would say pick a pilot project. Just pick a key role and do it manually if you like. So actually you talk to people, use some data, find out what are the skills that they're actually using one day to the next, and then start to design a program perhaps from a learning perspective or job description from a recruitment perspective which actually corresponds to the skills that people need rather than just broad competencies or content or topics that they should cover, and see how that goes. So pick something small, have a go at it, learn something from that and kind of scale it up.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to ask you some silly questions now, which will seem very silly in the context of that conversation. But we've got an L&D bin. What L&D practice, would you happily put in that bin forever?
Oh my gosh, that's a big question because it's everything that looks like education. So I do this bit where I got a presentation I gave is stop doing education, start doing learning. So everything that we've inherited from this educational model, so the idea of putting topics into courses and distributing them via an LMS, all of that It's just, we're only doing it because it's some sort of weird educational convention. So I think I would pick up all those bits that, you'd pick up the central concept at the middle, education, and you'd pick it up and you'd find there's all these things dangling off it, like pathways and courses and LMSs and, and I would just put all of that in the bin. Say, right, let's start again. Help people with the job.
Nice.
How do we do that?
Okay, well, marvelous. Thank you very much for that, and thanks for joining us again today, and for helping so much. I think, in particular, with examples and practical advice, which whilst we can talk about the kind of big topics, I always hope that we can help people come away with takeaways, and you've really helped that today. So much appreciated.
Good. Oh, thank you. It's been fun.